Hello, everyone. This is our presentation on utilitarianism, philosophy 1332, project number 2. So utilitarianism is based on the greatest happiness principle, which kind of states that the right actions promote happiness and the wrong actions promote the opposite of happiness. And the happiness of the greatest amount or the greatest number should be the principle that guides conduct. And there are kind of 4 subcategories of utilitarianism. Consequentialism, which is your actions morality depend only on the actions itself. Maximalism is the right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of pleasure. Consequences and pleasure, so consequences only matter if they produce pleasure or displeasure, and a subcategory of this is hedonism, which states that pleasure is the only good and displeasure is the only bad. Equal consideration of interests, everyone's pleasure matters equally, no one is more important than the other person. For the preamble, it just talks about engineering being an important and learned profession, and we're supposed to have the highest standards of honesty and integrity, also have a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all, and focuses on things like honesty, fairness, equity, and also focuses on the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare for all people. And we must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. So from the perspective of utilitarianism, the highest principle of ethical conduct would be the one that's concerned with promoting happiness and pleasure. So an example of this would be the impact of environmental regulations increasing the costs for consumer goods. So this would make the total amount of happiness decrease potentially. People would be upset that there are higher prices, which would violate utilitarianism. However, this would have to be done to protect the health and safety for all if reducing the cost would make it a safer place for people to live. Also, the idea of fairness for services provided aligns with the 4th characteristic of utilitarianism, which is the equal consideration of interests. Because everyone's interests would matter equally, this guideline prevents certain individuals from having more power or impact than another person on engineering services. So that's one of the fundamental guidelines of utilitarianism as well.
The next section is the Code of Ethics Fundamental Canons. So the Code of Ethics details the guidelines engineers should follow to fulfill their professional duties. The first code is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. The second is to perform services in areas of competence. Then issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Avoid deceptive acts, and conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So an engineer following utilitarianism would not necessarily follow the fundamental canons. This is because the engineer would have to weigh the outcomes of either option using the greatest happiness principle and decide which provided the maximum amount of happiness and minimum amount of unhappiness for all parties involved. So a major component of utilitarianism is act versus rule utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, an action is bad if it results in bad consequences. So an engineer who followed act utilitarianism would have to predict the outcome and resulting happiness of their action. In rule utilitarianism, an action is wrong if it violates a rule that would produce good for most people. So an engineer who followed rule utilitarianism would most likely follow the rules set by the Code of Ethics. Some examples are utilitarianism fulfills the first fundamental canon by the greatest happiness principle. If engineers act to provide the greatest amount of happiness, the safety, health, and welfare of the majority of the public will be achieved. And in Section 1, Part A, if an engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstances that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client with such other authority as may be appropriate. So an engineering following both act or rule utilitarianism would follow this rule as endangering life or property would not provide the greatest happiness to the public and would outweigh any possible good that could come to the engineer or employer. Another example is Section 3, Part A. An engineer following utilitarianism would not necessarily follow this rule because in act utilitarianism, an engineer would say to be truthful in a manner that would provide public happiness and to be deceitful in a manner that would provide public unhappiness in order to maintain public happiness. Rule utilitarianism would say to be objective and truthful because it follows the rule that it was made to be an ethical standard of practice. A final example is in section 5 part A, and an engineer following utilitarianism would follow this rule because act utilitarianism would say not to falsify their qualifications or permits if the action of incompetence would cause more unhappiness to the public or to the employer than to any personal happiness the engineer would get. And rule utilitarianism would also say not to falsify their qualifications because it follows the rule that was made to be an ethical standard of practice.
For this section, we will discuss some statements in professional obligations. So first statement was engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. And for part B, it mentions that engineers shall advise their clients or employers when they believe a project will not be successful. So for this statement, we can understand that the professional obligations require the clients and the employers to know the consequences of the project, and that consequences of the project is very important. So it is aligning with the importance of the consequences to which are the expected results of the project. So another statement is engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. And part A specifically mentions the actions that would bring up more happiness to the community. That shows that engineers are encouraged to produce the greater amount of happiness for the society. And this logic aligns with the idea of utilitarianism. Some statements may align with utilitarianism. I picked 3 and 4. So statement 3 says the engineer shall avoid all conduct or practice that deceives the public. And statement 4 shows that engineers shall not disclose without consent to from a client or employer or public body. So as you can see from this statement, certain actions are not allowed to perform, even if the engineer believes that doing them can provide more happiness to society. Maybe deceiving the public can provide more happiness, but these actions are not allowed according to this professional obligation statement. So utilitarianism is based on happiness. The preamble both aligns and conflicts with utilitarianism for some statements. The fundamental canons and rules of practice section evaluates and determines that engineers following utilitarianism do not necessarily follow the code of ethics. The professional obligation section acknowledges the importance of knowing the consequences and making more pleasures in the world, but it does not allow engineers to do certain actions, even if they can promote more happiness in some cases. So I believe the professional obligation section aligns with the idea in preamble. One way to make code more in line with utilitarianism is to modify and generate more rules that promote the goodness of the results.